May 13, 1943. Enfidaville, Tunisia. At 10 Corps headquarters, a senior Axis officer arrived to surrender, not as a representative, not through an intermediary. In person. Marshal Giovanni Messe, commander of the 1st Italian Army, stepped forward. Beside him was Major General Kurt von Liebenstein, commanding the German 164th Light Africa Division, a man who had received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross just 3 days earlier. These were not minor figures. They commanded what remained of the Axis military presence in North Africa, roughly 238,000 soldiers who would lay down their arms that day. The officer who received that surrender was Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, acting as temporary Corps commander. A New Zealander, not a Briton, not an American. A general from a country of 1.6 million people, fewer than the city of Hamburg, who had sent farmers, tradesmen, teachers, and shepherds across the Indian Ocean to fight in someone else's war, and had ended up standing at the close of the most significant Axis defeat since Stalingrad. 3 months earlier, in February 1943, an entire German army had surrendered at Stalingrad. Now, in Tunisia, another massive Axis force was finished, and the man formally receiving the documents, shaking hands with the beaten commanders, standing in the Tunisian sun at the end of 3 years of desert war, was representing a division from the South Pacific that the German military establishment had never given a second thought to when it first appeared in Egypt in early 1940. That gap between how the 2nd New Zealand Division was regarded and what it eventually became is the story here. New Zealand in September 1939 was not a nation that invited military fear. It was a dominion of the British Empire at the far end of the world, separated from the nearest continent by 2,000 kilometers of ocean, with an economy built on wool, meat, and dairy exports. Its largest city, Auckland, had a population of around 200,000 people. Its standing army was negligible. It had no indigenous armor, no modern artillery to speak of, and no recent institutional memory of large-scale conventional warfare outside of the catastrophe of 1914 to 1918, a war in which New Zealand had lost 16,697 dead from a population of barely 1 million, the highest per capita death rate of any nation involved. When Prime Minister Michael Savage declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939, the statement he made was frank about where New Zealand stood in the world. Where Britain goes, we go. Where she stands, we stand. There was no pretense of strategic independence, no suggestion that New Zealand had a separate calculation to make. Britain was in danger. New Zealand would send men. The 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force, the 2NZEF, began forming almost immediately. Its commander was Major General Bernard Freyberg, a man of remarkable personal biography. Born in England, raised in New Zealand, decorated in the First World. War with the Victoria Cross and 3 DSOs, a man Winston Churchill would later describe as his salamander for his habit of seeking out the hottest parts of any fire. Freyberg was technically a British Army officer, but his loyalties were unambiguous. He had accepted the New Zealand command on the explicit condition that his division would answer to the New Zealand government, fight as a complete formation, and not be parceled out in brigade groups at British convenience. That condition would matter enormously in the years ahead. The first echelon of the 2NZEF left New Zealand in January 1940, arriving in Egypt in February. They were followed by subsequent echelons over the coming months. These men were overwhelmingly volunteers. Conscription wasn't introduced until June 1940. And they came from every corner of the country. Farmers from Canterbury and Southland, freezing workers from the North Island, timber workers, bank clerks, mechanics, and Maori men from Iwi across both islands who would form the 28th Maori Battalion, the only unit in the British Commonwealth to be organized on ethnicity and eventually decorated more times per capita than any other New Zealand battalion in the war. To the German military intelligence analysts watching Allied force dispositions in 1940 and 1941, the New Zealanders were a Commonwealth curiosity, one more colonial contingent among several: the British, South Africans, Australians, Indians, Canadians. The empire was large and its contributions varied. Nothing in the two NZEF's initial composition announced anything exceptional. They arrived without the battle reputation of the Australians who had been fighting since 1940, without the institutional sophistication of the British Regular Army, and without the national mythology that some other formations carried into battle. They were simply there. And that, in the minds of the men they would eventually face, was about as far as the assessment went. That dismissal would not survive contact with the ground realities of the next 3 years. But in 1940, it was entirely reasonable. What the German analysts could not have known, because it had not yet happened, was that the precise qualities the New Zealand division would need to become exceptional were not ones that could be identified in a peacetime ledger. They would be built, brutally and at significant cost, through a sequence of campaigns that seemed at the time to be mostly composed of retreats, disasters, and near annihilations. Greece, Crete, the Western Desert. A series of engagements in which the New Zealanders repeatedly took their objectives, repeatedly held their ground, and repeatedly found that the support they had been promised had not arrived. Each time, they absorbed the lesson. They changed the way they fought. They stopped assuming anyone else would be where they were supposed to be, and they began designing their tactics around that assumption. By the time they reached Tunisia in January 1943, they were a fundamentally different organization than the one that had disembarked in Egypt 3 years earlier. Montgomery's own Chief of Staff, Brigadier Francis de Guingand, described them as the Eighth Army's mobile shock troops. That description had not been available in 1940. It was earned. But there is something else that sits at the center of this story. Something that connects the Enfidaville surrender ceremony to the farms and towns the New Zealand soldiers came from. By the end of the North African campaign, the cost to New Zealand would be 2,989 dead, more than 4,000 taken prisoner, and over 7,000 wounded. For a country of 1.6 million people, these numbers were not abstractions. They were felt in every town, in every community. Post-war calculations would show that New Zealand's ratio of dead per million of population, 6,684, was the highest in the entire Commonwealth, higher than Britain, higher than Australia, higher than Canada. This was not a nation of professional soldiers sending a professional army to war. It was a small country sending its people, and those people, dismissed by the military establishment they had come to assist, would end up at the center of some of the most consequential battles in the Western Desert Campaign. And at Enfidaville on May 13, 1943, receiving the formal surrender of a beaten Axis force that once thought they were barely worth categorizing. The question is how that happened. The answer starts not in Tunisia, but in the ruins of campaigns most people have forgotten, fought across 3 years in the deserts of Libya and Egypt and the mountains of Greece and Crete, where a division that nobody feared slowly learned exactly what it took to survive, and then to win. There is a statement, widely attributed to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, that addresses the New Zealanders directly. It is a statement that, even with the historiographical debate around its precise sourcing, captures something real about how the Axis eventually came to regard the men who had been written off as farming amateurs. You will hear that statement by the end of this story. First, you need to understand what it costs to earn it. In April 1941, the 2nd New Zealand Division went to Greece. It came back with nothing, not nothing in the melodramatic sense, not nothing as a figure of speech, literally nothing. When the Royal Navy completed the evacuation from the Greek mainland in the last week of April, The New Zealanders left behind almost all of their artillery, their transport vehicles, and their heavy weapons. They had been in Greece for less than 4 weeks. The German invasion began on April 6th. The Allied line was outflanked almost immediately. What followed was not a fighting withdrawal in any organized sense, it was a controlled collapse, units leapfrogging south through a country that provided no defensible terrain, while the Luftwaffe had uncontested control of the air above them. By the time it was over, 291 New Zealanders were dead, and more than 1,800 were in German captivity. Most of the men evacuated from Greece were sent directly to Crete. There was no pause, no refit, no time to process what had just happened. They arrived on the island with barely the equipment they carried on their backs and were immediately folded into the defense of a position that had received almost none of the preparation it needed. Freyberg, placed in overall command of Allied forces on Crete, warned his superiors weeks in advance that the island could not be held without air cover. The air cover did not come. The German airborne assault began on May 20th, 1941. Hundreds of paratroopers dropped from Junkers transport aircraft across the north of the island, around Malem, Canea, Retimo, and Heraklion. The fighting that followed was some of the most vicious the New Zealanders had yet encountered. At Maleme, a misread of the tactical situation led to a New Zealand withdrawal from positions overlooking the airfield. That withdrawal proved critical. The Germans poured reinforcements through Malem in the days that followed, and the Allied position deteriorated beyond recovery. By June 1st, Crete was German. Of the New Zealanders who had been sent to defend it, 671 were dead and 2,180 were taken prisoner. More than 6,000 Germans were killed or wounded in the assault, testimony to how hard the defense had been, even as it failed. The division came back to Egypt for the second time in 6 weeks, again without its heavy equipment, again absorbing a defeat that had not been of its own making. This needs to be understood clearly because it is easy to look at that sequence, Greece, then Crete, then the disasters that would follow in the desert, and conclude that the New Zealand division was simply a formation that kept losing. That reading misses something essential. In both Greece and Crete, the New Zealanders had fought well at the tactical level. They had held positions they were ordered to hold. They had delayed advances that more poorly trained units would have been overrun by immediately. What failed around them was the strategic framework they had been inserted into. Chunut, the decision to send a force to Greece that had no realistic chance of success, the absence of air support that should never have been promised, the broader failures of Allied coordination at the command level. The men who came back to Egypt understood this distinction clearly. It would matter. The first desert campaign, Operation Crusader, began in November 1941. The objective was to relieve the siege of Tobruk, where an Allied garrison had been surrounded since April. The New Zealand division crossed the Libyan frontier on November 18th. For the first several days, things went well. The 5th Brigade advanced toward Sollum and Bardia, cutting off Axis supply routes. The 6th Brigade pushed west along the Sidi Rezeg escarpment, a low, stony ridge about 40 kilometers southeast of Tobruk, fighting their way forward in a series of night attacks against fierce resistance. On November 27th, men from the 19th Battalion linked up with the Tobruk garrison at Ed Duda. The siege was broken. The New Zealand division had done what it had been sent to do. Then the tanks didn't come. Between November 28th and December 1st, German and Italian forces counterattacked at Sidi Rezeg and Belhamed. The 4th and 6th Brigades were hit from multiple directions by German armor. It had been planned that British armor would support the New Zealanders in holding what they had taken. The armor did not arrive. The battalions dug in on the rocky escarpment had no effective anti-tank defense. By December 1st, German tanks had overrun large sections of both brigades. The corridors into Tobruk were severed. Thousands of New Zealanders went into captivity for the 3rd time in a single year. When the final accounting was done, Crusader had cost the 2nd New Zealand Division 879 dead, 1,699 wounded, and 2,042 taken prisoner, 4,620 casualties in total. It was the most expensive campaign the division would fight in the entire war. And the New Zealand official history noted something specific about who had paid the heaviest price. More New Zealanders were killed or taken prisoner in Crusader than in any other campaign, and more New Zealanders died, were wounded, or went missing than in any other 8th Army division involved in the same operation. The New Zealand government insisted the division withdraw to Syria to recover. Freyberg's men spent the first half of 1942 there, rebuilding. In June 1942, the situation in the desert deteriorated sharply. Rommel's forces broke through at Gazala, and Tobruk, which had resisted siege for months in 1941, fell in a single day. The New Zealand division was recalled urgently from Syria and rushed back into the line. They arrived at a position called Minkar Qaim in Egypt and found themselves surrounded almost immediately by the 21st Panzer Division. What happened next became part of the division's institutional memory. Freyberg, wounded in the neck by shrapnel, led a breakout at night through the German lines at bayonet point. His men punched through, disengaged, and drove 160 kilometers east to the Alamein line. The encirclement had lasted hours. The escape was total. They fell back to El Alamein and held. Through July 1942, the division fought 2 engagements that would come to define its relationship with British armor for the remainder of the campaign. On the night of July 14th to 15th, the New Zealanders attacked and captured Ruwisat Ridge in a night assault, advancing nearly 10 kilometers against defended positions. By dawn on the 15th, they held the ridge. British armor was supposed to move forward in support before first light. It did not. When German tanks appeared, the New Zealanders on the ridge had no effective answer. The cost was 1,405 casualties, of whom all but 290 were killed or captured. Among the prisoners was Captain Charles Upham, who had already won 1 Victoria Cross and would, while wounded and in captivity, be recommended for a second. 1 week later, on the night of July the 21st to 22nd, it happened again. The 6th Brigade attacked the El Marir Depression southwest of Ruwisat Ridge. They took their objectives in the early hours of the morning. 2 British armored brigades were committed to move through the gap the infantry had created. The minesweepers could not clear a passage in time. When the German 5th and 8th Panzer regiments counterattacked at dawn, the 6th Brigade was exposed, unsupported, and hit by armor on open ground. Another 900 New Zealand casualties in a single morning. Brigadier General Inglis, commanding the division in Freyberg's absence due to wounds, declared afterward that he would not consider any further operation of the same kind. The official New Zealand history recorded that after El Marir, a sour, discontented mood settled over the division, not directed at the Germans, but at the 8th Army's methods, and specifically at the British armor. That distinction matters, and it explains what happened next. The distrust that hardened in the summer of 1942 was not bitterness or defeatism. It was a professional recalibration. The New Zealand division stopped assuming that any part of the battle plan except its own piece would be executed as ordered. It began designing its attacks around the assumption that it would have to sustain itself, to keep its flanks, to hold its objectives, to fight through whatever came after the infantry had done its job. It became, by necessity, better at all arms coordination within its own formation than any other division in the 8th Army. This is the part that gets lost when the Desert Campaign is reduced to a narrative of victorious names: El Alamein, Tobruk, Tunisia. The education that produced the division which eventually received the Axis surrender at Enfidaville was built out of Sidi Rezegh, Ruwisat, El Marir, battles that ended badly, battles where the New Zealanders did their job and were nonetheless consumed by failures elsewhere. Each one taught the same lesson. Depend on yourself. Know exactly where your flanks are. Don't wait for support that may not come. By October 1942, when Montgomery launched the Second Battle of El Alamein and gave the 2nd New Zealand Division the task of leading Operation Supercharge, the breakthrough assault on the Axis line, that education had been fully absorbed. The division that stepped off on the night of November 1st to 2nd and punched the hole through which the 8th Army poured was not the formation that had arrived in Egypt in early 1940. It had been remade at considerable cost into something that Montgomery's own Chief of Staff would describe as the Army's mobile shock troops. That description was earned, engagement by engagement, over 3 years of being let down, overrun, evacuated, and sent back. The losses from those 3 years, Greece, Crete, Crusader, Ruisat, El Merair, are not a record of failure. They are the cost of the education that made Tunisia possible. The next lesson was Tebaga Gap, and that one the New Zealanders would deliver themselves. On the night of November 1st to 2nd, 1942, the 2nd New Zealand Division stepped off into the dark at El Alamein for the last time. What Montgomery had been building toward for weeks, the methodical attrition, the wearing down of Rommel's supply lines and armor, the careful accumulation of numerical superiority, had to end in a single decisive blow. The opening assault of Operation Lightfoot on October 23rd had broken into the Axis defenses, with the New Zealanders capturing Miteria Ridge in the initial push. But the momentum had not translated into a breakthrough. Congestion, coordination failures, and hesitant armored leadership had again prevented the infantry gains from being exploited. Montgomery needed a second punch, aimed at a different point in the line. He called it Operation Supercharge, and he gave it to Freiburg. The task was specific: punch a corridor through the Axis defenses deep enough for British armor to pour through and destroy what remained of Rommel's tank. At 1:05 in the morning, the infantry. At 1:05 in the morning, the infantry advanced. The New Zealanders, with the 28th Maury Battalion attached to the leading British brigades, drove through the prepared positions and seized their objectives against fierce resistance. The 9th Armored Brigade, assigned to exploit the breakthrough, lost nearly all its tanks against the Axis anti-tank screen, but the sacrifice held the line long enough. By November 4th, the Afrika Corps was out of fuel and facing encirclement. Rommel ordered a full retreat. The Axis force that had held Egypt to a standstill for 2 years was now running west, and it would not stop until it ran out of continent. The pursuit that followed covered more than 2,000 kilometers, from El Alamein across the Libyan desert, past Tobruk and Benghazi, through El Agheila and Sirte and the long coastal road. The New Zealand Division was used repeatedly in flanking moves, what the official records call left hooks, designed to cut off the retreating Axis columns before they could establish new defensive lines. At El Agheila in December 1942, and again at Nophelia, Freiburg's corps swung out into the desert to encircle the position while other forces fixed the enemy frontally. The moves worked, but never quickly enough to trap the mass of the retreating army. Rommel understood the threat of encirclement and always disengaged in time. On January 23, 1943, the 2nd New Zealand Division entered Tripoli. The city that had been Rommel's principal supply base for 2 years was now in Allied hands. 3 years of fighting had finally cleared the entire North African coastline from Egypt to the Tunisian border. But the campaign was not over. Rommel's forces had fallen back behind the Mareth Line, a system of fortifications originally built by the French in the 1930s to defend Tunisia against Italian Libya, and had reinforced it considerably. The line ran from the sea inland through the Matmata Hills. It was the last defensible position before Tunis. On March 19, 1943, Montgomery launched the frontal assault, Operation Pugilist. the 50th Division established a bridgehead across the Wadi Zigzao, a natural tank obstacle with banks up to 70 feet high, but the terrain prevented the armor and anti-tank guns from moving forward in support. On March 22nd, the 15th Panzer Division counterattacked and recaptured most of the bridgehead. The frontal assault had failed. It was the same pattern the New Zealanders had watched repeatedly from the other side. Infantry taking ground they couldn't hold without armor unable to move forward fast enough to matter. Montgomery needed a different option. The different option existed because of something the French military had declared impossible in 1938. In their survey of the terrain south of the Matmata Hills, French engineers had concluded that the Jebel Dahar, the rough country west of the mountains, was not passable for motorized vehicles. The Mareth Line's southern end was therefore left unextended inland. There was no point fortifying ground that couldn't be crossed. By 1943, motor vehicles could cross it. The Long-Range Desert Group had already proven this with a patrol that penetrated through Wilder's Gap, reached Tabaga Gap on the other side of the Matmata Hills, and continued north all the way to Gafsa, where it made contact with the Allied First Army advancing from the west. The route was there. It was rough, demanding, and 200 kilometers through terrain the French had written off. But it was there. Montgomery formed the New Zealand Corps for the operation. Freyberg's existing division of 14,500 men, including the 28th Maori Battalion, was reinforced with the British 8th Armored Brigade, the French Force L, under General Leclerc, and the TA administrative and fire support of ex-Corps headquarters under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. The plan was a two-stage movement, a night march through Wilder's Gap and across the Jebel Dahar, followed by an assault on the Axis positions at Tabaga Gap, a 10-kilometer-wide valley through which the road north ran between two ranges of high ground. If the New Zealand Corps could break through Tabaga Gap and reach the coast at Gabes, the entire 1st Italian Army defending the Mareth Line would be cut off. The Corps arrived at Tabaga Gap on the night of March 20th. An initial attack that night seized several Italian positions, but Freyberg paused rather than pressing immediately. German and Italian reinforcements, including elements of the 164th Light Division and 21st Panzer Division, were moving to block the gap. The opportunity for a quick decision was lost. For 5 days, the two sides faced each other across the valley floor, while Montgomery strengthened the flanking force and finalized the plan for the main assault. Operation Supercharge II launched on March 26th. It began with a combined artillery barrage and a low-level air assault, fighter bombers coming in directly over the infantry to suppress the defenses ahead of them. Then the armor moved, with infantry following in carriers and on foot. The 5th New Zealand Brigade attacked on the right. The 6th New Zealand Brigade attacked on the left. Behind them, the 1st Armored Division waited to push through once the gap was open. On the right flank, where the 5th Brigade advanced, one of the assault objectives was Point 209, a hill held by the 2nd Battalion of the 433rd Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 164th Light Division, the 28th Maori. Battalion's C Company drew the assignment. 2nd Lieutenant Moana Nui Akiwangarimu was 23 years old. He had been born in Werponga on the East Coast, educated at Te Aute College, and had served with the battalion through Greece, Crete, and the full length of the IESN Desert Campaign before being commissioned as a platoon commander in April 1942. On the afternoon of March 26th, he led his platoon straight up the face of the hill under sustained mortar and machine gun fire. The official VC citation records what happened next in plain language that requires no amplification. He was first to reach the crest. He personally destroyed at least 2 enemy machine gun posts. The enemy counterattacked, and his much-reduced platoon repelled the attack by direct engagement. He was wounded in the shoulder by rifle fire, then in the leg by shrapnel. Both his company commander and battalion commander ordered him back. He refused, saying he would stay a little while with his men. Through the night, with the enemy holding the reverse slope of the same hill 20 yards away, the attacks came repeatedly. During one assault, the enemy used grenades to break through a section of his line. Ngarimu ran to the breach. Those he didn't kill, he drove back with his Tommy gun, and with stones when the ammunition ran out. By morning, only Ngarimu and 2 unwounded men remained. Reinforcements reached them. Then the enemy came again. He was killed on his feet, firing from the hip, and fell among the German dead. He was awarded the Victoria Cross posthumously. It was the first VC awarded to a Maori soldier serving with New Zealand forces. The medal was presented to his parents at a gathering of 7,000 people at Ruatoria in October 1943. The breakthrough at Tabaga Gap was complete by March 28th. Axis forces abandoned the Mareth Line entirely and fell back 40 miles to the next defensive position at Wadi Akarit. On March 29th, New Zealand troops captured Gabes. Montgomery sent Freyberg a personal message acknowledging the result. The left hook had worked. For the second time in 5 months, Freyberg's corps had been handed the most difficult operational task available and had executed it. But the Axis forces had not surrendered. They had retreated. They were now compressed into a shrinking perimeter in northern Tunisia, their backs to the Mediterranean, still occupying ground they intended to hold. In front of the New Zealanders now stood Takruna, a limestone rock fortress rising out of the Tunisian plain that one British general would later call the site of the most gallant feat of arms he had ever witnessed in the entire war. By April 1943, the Axis position in North Africa had contracted to a bridgehead roughly the size of Wales. The front ran from the Mediterranean coast south through the hills of Tunisia, and along its length the defending forces, German and Italian, what remained of them, occupied every piece of high ground they could find. They had been retreating for 5 months. They were short of fuel, short of ammunition, and being compressed from 2 directions by Allied armies closing in from east and west. But they were not yet finished, and the terrain gave them options. In the hills around Enfidaville, approximately 100 kilometers south of Tunis, they had turned a series of rocky outcrops into defensive positions, the approach to which was almost entirely controlled by whoever held the high ground. The 2nd New Zealand Division was now part of X-Corps under Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. On April 19th, Horrocks's corps attacked on a 3-divisional front. The 4th Indian Division on the Adi left, the New Zealand Division in the center, the 50th Northumbrian Division engaged with fire on the right. The New Zealand task was to clear the foothills between Enfidaville and Takruna. The 6th Brigade, attacking on the right flank of the New Zealand sector, achieved its objectives without severe difficulty. The ground was hard but navigable, the resistance serious but manageable. By the following morning, the 6th Brigade's battalions were on their objectives and consolidating. The 5th Brigade, attacking on the left, ran into Takruna. The feature is visible from a considerable distance, a limestone pinnacle rising approximately 200 meters from the flat Tunisian plain. It sits at the end of a ridge with sheer faces on 3 sides and an approach from the rear that the defenders had mined and fortified. The top was roughly crescent-shaped, divided into 4 distinct areas, a narrow ledge connected by steps to a pinnacle, the pinnacle itself virtually inaccessible on all 4 sides, a small village of stone buildings at the western end, and the larger settlement of Takruna village at the base near the road. The garrison holding it consisted of 1 battalion of the Italian 66th Infantry Regiment from the Trieste Division, elements of 2 companies from the Folgore Parachute Division, and a German anti-tank platoon of 20 men. The 5th Brigade's plan assigned the Maori battalions B Company and C Company to advance through the olive groves east of the rock, skirt its base, and push through toward the Enfidaville-Zaguan road beyond it. D Company was to follow and then wheel back to assault Takruna from the rear. 2 sections of B Company were to detach and create a diversion at the base of the cliff. The 21st and 23rd Battalions had their own objectives on the flanks. The night attack of April 19th to 20th failed. The approaches to Takruna were extensively mined. The olive groves and cactus hedges between the start line and the rock had mines sown throughout them. Indirect fire from the heights was continuous and accurate. The defenders had pre-registered their guns on every likely axis of approach. Companies became separated in the dark. Officers fell. By the time the advanced dressing station reported back to 5th Brigade headquarters, they had 11 wounded officers from the Maori Battalion alone. The commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Bennett, was wounded by a mine. By morning, the battalion had lost 12 officers and 104 other ranks, killed, wounded, or missing out of the 319 men who had started the night's fighting. The CO and all but one company commander were dead or out of action. The attack on Takruna had stalled. Brigade headquarters began planning a daylight assault. Then, at approximately 5 o'clock in the morning, someone at brigade headquarters noticed something unexpected. Prisoners were coming down from the pinnacle, a stream of Italian soldiers, hands raised, descending from a feature that was supposed to still be held in full strength. What had happened was this. A section of B Company, 12 men, had spent the night in a wadi at the bottom of Takruna's eastern face. They were cut off from the rest of their company by the same mines and fire that had broken the main assault. Their orders had been to create a diversion. The diversion had served its purpose and then collapsed into the general chaos of the night. They could hear what was happening to the rest of the battalion. They could hear the rock above them. Their section commander was Sergeant Han Manahi, 28 years old, of Tearawa descent from Rotorua. He had been with the battalion since the beginning, Greece, Crete, the full length of the desert. He held the rank of sergeant, leading a section of 12 men in a battle where the battalion above him had just lost nearly all of its officers. At dawn, without orders from any superior, Manahi split his section into 2 parties and began to climb. The cliff face on the eastern side of Takruna was not a climbing route. It was a sheer limestone wall, the kind of terrain that military planners had looked at and routed their attacks around. Manahi's section went straight up it in 2 groups, using handholds in the rock. When they reached the top, they found the Folgore paratroopers and the Italian infantry, and the German anti-tank platoon occupying a position that had just spent several hours repelling a brigade-sized assault from below. 12 men cleared the summit. By 7 o'clock that morning, prisoners were descending the accessible routes under Maori escort, and Manahi held a position that 5th Brigade headquarters had been planning to assault in daylight with a fully coordinated attack. Lieutenant Shaw of 15 Platoon, 28th Battalion, followed the section up with reinforcements and took command of the position. The prisoners continued coming down. It did not hold. The enemy counterattacked that evening and retook the pinnacle. What Manahi's section had taken could not be held without support that had not yet arrived. The ledge below the pinnacle was held through the night by a mixed group, New Zealanders from several companies, but the topmost point went back to the enemy. On April 21st, a fresh assault retook it. The fighting on and around Takruna continued until April 23rd, when the last defenders were overcome. Final count, 300 prisoners taken. New Zealand Division casualties across the full battle for Takruna and its surrounding foothills. 536, 46 killed, 404 wounded, 86 missing. The 5th Brigade was relieved on April 23rd. In the official account written afterward, the brigade was described as having produced in the capture of Takruna a feat that had caught the attention of the whole army. Horrocks, Freiberg, Alexander, and Kippenberger, all 4 submitted recommendations to London that Sergeant Han Manahi be awarded the Victoria Cross. The recommendation from Horrocks, the Korps commander, described Menahi's action as the most gallant feat of arms he had witnessed in the course of the entire war. 4 generals, 1 corps commander, 1 army commander, 1 theater commander, and Freyberg, who had now commanded the New Zealand division through 3 years of campaigning from Greece to Tunisia. London downgraded the recommendation to a Distinguished Conduct Medal. No explanation was publicly issued. No account of why the recommendation was found insufficient was entered into the accessible record. The DCM was awarded. Menahi accepted it. The Victoria Cross recommendation and the 4 signatures attached to it remained in the file. For 64 years, nothing changed. In 2007, in a ceremony at Government House in Wellington, a representative of Queen Elizabeth II presented a posthumous honor to Menahi's family. By then, Menahi had been dead for 11 years. The New Zealand government had spent years investigating the original downgrade and had been unable to find a satisfactory explanation for the decision. The posthumous honor acknowledged an injustice. It did not award a Victoria Cross. The facts are as stated above. The reader can draw their own conclusions. 3 weeks after Takruna, it was over. On May 13, 1943, 238,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. Bernard Freyberg, as temporary Corps commander, accepted the surrender personally. And somewhere in the chain of defeated men, the remnants of the Afrika Corps, the men Rommel had led, was the answer to the question this story started with. What exactly had they said about these New Zealanders? On the morning of May 13, 1943, the last organized Axis resistance in North Africa ended. Marshal Giovanni Messe, commanding the remnants of the 1st Italian Army, had formally requested armistice terms the previous day. His German counterpart, Major General Kurt von Liebenstein of the 164th Light Africa Division, the same division whose Panzer Grenadiers had held Point 209 at Tabaga Gap 6 weeks earlier, surrendered that morning to Bernard Freyberg. Freyberg was serving as acting Corps commander of X-Corps in the final days of the campaign. He accepted the capitulation in person. The numbers from the Tunisian surrender have never been fully reconciled. The accepted range runs from 238,000 to 275,000 Axis prisoners. The German official count acknowledged more than 130,000 German troops alone. For context, 3 months earlier at Stalingrad, 91,000 German soldiers had surrendered to the Soviet Army, an event recorded as one of the most significant military defeats in history. In Tunisia, more Germans surrendered than at Stalingrad. The Afrika Corps, which had fought across North Africa for 2 years and driven the British Army back to the gates of Cairo, ceased to exist as a fighting force on a Tuesday morning in May. The 2nd New Zealand Division had been part of the force that put it there. What that cost New Zealand requires a moment to register against the size of the country. In 1940, when the 2nd New Zealand Expeditionary Force began embarking, New Zealand's total population was approximately 1.6 million people. The North African campaign alone, from the first deployment to Egypt through the final surrender in Tunisia, cost the division 2,989 dead, 4,041 taken prisoner, and more than 7,000 wounded. The per capita death rate for New Zealand across the entire Second World War was the highest in the Commonwealth, calculated at 6,684 dead per million of population. These were not conscripted men filling quotas. New Zealand had voluntary enlistment for overseas service. The men in the desert had gone by choice. The question the title of this story poses, why Germans would have laughed at New Zealand, was never really about military competence. German military intelligence in 1939 and 1940 assessed colonial dominion contingents the way most of the world did, as secondary formations, reliable for garrison duties, unlikely to perform at the level of professional standing armies with decades of institutional development behind them. The assessment was not unusual. It was simply wrong. There is a quote that circulates widely in connection with this story, attributed to Rommel. "If I had to take hell, I would use the Australians to take it, and the New Zealanders to hold it." This quote cannot be definitively sourced to Rommel's own writings or verified correspondence. The only traceable attribution leads to a 2009 secondary history by Samuel Mitcham, not to any primary document. Rommel's own memoir, The Rommel Papers, edited by Basil Liddell Hart and published in 1953, contains no such statement. The quote has spread because it sounds like something Rommel would say and because it flatters both nations it names. That is not the same as it being documented. What Rommel actually wrote about the Anzac forces is recorded, and it is unambiguous. In letters to his wife during the Tobruk siege in 1941, he described the Australian garrison as fighting magnificently and possessing training superior to his own forces. He acknowledged in his field diary that the Afrika Korps had encountered opponents of a caliber it had not met since the opening campaigns in Poland. This is not the memorable phrasing of the disputed quote, but it is what the historical record contains. The other quote, "Give me the Maori battalion and I will conquer the world," follows the same pattern. It is attributed to Rommel, but the sourced version of that statement comes from Rommel's former Chief of Staff, General Siegfried Westphal. Westphal made the remark at a post-war reunion of Afrika Korps veterans attended by a delegation from the Maori Battalion, at which point he explicitly attributed the sentiment to Rommel. Whether the attribution is accurate cannot be verified from Rommel's surviving writings. What can be said is this. Westphal, who had served beside Rommel through the full North African campaign, said it. He said it to the men of the battalion in person. He was not speaking for publication. The distinction matters because this story has not needed invented praise to make its case. The record contains enough documented testimony. Montgomery, in his post-war assessment, described Freiberg as the finest fighting divisional commander he had encountered in the war. Major General Francis de Guingand, who served as Montgomery's Chief of Staff through the Desert Campaign, described the New Zealand Division as mobile shock troops, the formation that 8th Army turned to when the situation required. The hardest task to be done by the most capable available force. These are primary source statements from the men who commanded the theater. They are on the record. The question of what the enemy thought is partly answerable and partly not. The partially answerable part is this. German and Italian forces who faced the New Zealand Division repeatedly over 3 years adjusted their tactical planning around it. The 164th Light Division, which held Point 209 against Ngarimu's platoon at Tabaga Gap, and whose surrender Freiberg accepted at Enfidaville, was one of the better German formations in Africa. The Folgore paratroopers who held Takruna were elite troops who had fought since El Alamein, and who an Italian radio broadcast afterwards described as having defended to the last with sublime courage. They were beaten in the end by men who had come from a sheep-farming country on the other side of the world and who had been doing this for 3 years without stopping. The unanswerable part is the interior record, what individual German soldiers said among themselves, what Rommel wrote in the letters that did not survive, what assessments passed between officers in the Afrika Korps that were never transcribed. History keeps only what was written down and what survived. The inference is available to anyone who looks at the operational record. The 2nd New Zealand Division was used as the instrument of decision in every major engagement where the 8th Army needed a breakthrough. That is a functional assessment. It does not require a famous quote to support it. There is one loop this story opened in Chapter 1 that has not yet been closed. Hane Manahi survived the war. He returned to New Zealand in June 1943 as one of approximately 180 original members of the Maori Battalion selected to go home on furlough. He did not return to active service. He worked as a carpenter at a hospital in Rotorua and later as a traffic inspector. He received his Distinguished Conduct Medal from the Governor-General on December 18, 1945, at a ceremony with no particular public profile. He never spoke publicly about the downgrade of his Victoria Cross recommendation. He died in a car accident near Tepuk on March 29, 1986. After his death, a committee was formed by his Ijawi'i Te Arawa and his former comrades to pursue posthumous recognition. The process took 20 years. The New Zealand government made informal approaches to Buckingham Palace in the early 1990s. Both were unsuccessful. A formal bid was made in 2006 by the Minister of Defense, Phil Goff, asking directly that the Victoria Cross be awarded posthumously. Queen Elizabeth II declined, citing a ruling made by her father, King George VI, in 1949 that no further awards from the Second World War would be considered. The Queen did agree to recognize Manahi in a different form. On March 17, 2007, at Te Papayura Marae in Ohinamutu, Prince Andrew presented the Manahi family and Te Arawa with 3 items on behalf of the Queen: an altar cloth for St. Faith's Church near Manahi's burial place, a personal letter from the Queen acknowledging his gallantry, and a ceremonial sword from the royal collection. The award was structured around the line from the Maori Battalion's marching song, "For God, for King, and for Country," 1 item for each. The sword was subsequently presented to the Chief of the New Zealand Defence Force and is passed to each new Chief of Defence as a standing reminder. The Victoria Cross was not awarded. The record of the recommendation, signed by Kippenberger, Freiberg, Montgomery, Alexander, and General Henry Maitland Wilson, Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Command, remains as it was in 1943. What the Germans said about the New Zealanders, verified and unverified, is finally beside the point. The 2nd New Zealand Division mobilized from a country of 1.6 million farmers and tradespeople who had no standing army and no military tradition, deployed 16,000 kilometers from home and spent 3 years in the desert fighting some of the most capable formations the German and Italian militaries produced. They lost nearly 3,000 dead in North Africa alone. They broke the Axis line at El Alamein, flanked the Mareth line through terrain declared impassable, and scaled a 200-meter limestone cliff in the dark because the front of the hill wasn't working. They accepted the surrender of 238,000 men. At some point in that sequence, the laughing stopped. The record does not specify exactly when. Tobaga Gap is a reasonable guess.
May 15, 1969. Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Vallejo, California, 5:47 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. The night shift supervisor at Building Ways 3 walked the length of USS Guitarro, hull number SSN 665, a Sturgeon-class nuclear attack submarine, 92% complete, her black steel hull gleaming under mercury vapor lights that turned the evening fog into a diffuse grey glow. The air smelled of fresh paint, cutting oil, and the salt tang of San Francisco Bay mixing with diesel exhaust from the yard locomotives shuttling materials between warehouses. The supervisor carried a clipboard listing 17 work orders scheduled for completion before the weekend. He knew that Guitarro was already 6 months behind schedule and $23 million over budget. Not because of design flaws, but because of labor disputes, material shortages, and the chaos of managing dozens of subcontractors who treated the shipyard like feudal territory, each crew loyal to its foreman, none coordinating with the others. His orders, issued by the Mare Island Project Office and endorsed by the Navy's Supervisor of Shipbuilding, were to accelerate completion without compromising safety or quality. The progress reports showed steady advancement. Everything appeared routine. Then the submarine began to sink. The first indication came not as a dramatic lurch or a metallic groan, but as a subtle change in the trim of the hull, a slow downward tilt at the bow, that the supervisor noticed only because he had walked this deck hundreds of times and his body registered the angle as wrong. He stopped. He looked toward the bow. The forward section of the submarine, where the sonar dome housed the massive BQQ-2 passive sonar array, sat lower in the water than it had 15 minutes earlier. Not by much. A few inches. But submarines under construction do not settle unless they are taking on water, and submarines taking on water at the pier represent catastrophic failure of watertight integrity. He ran forward, boots ringing on the non-skid deck coating, shouting for the crew, working inside the forward compartments to report their status. No response. The interior communications system, not yet fully installed, consisted of sound-powered phones connecting only some compartments, and many of the junction boxes remained unwired. He reached the forward escape trunk, a vertical tube providing access to the interior, and shouted down into the darkness. His voice echoed off steel. Someone below shouted back, words unintelligible over the background noise of welding and pneumatic tools. The bow continued to settle. Inside the submarine, in the forward torpedo room, a welder working on ventilation duct mounts noticed water pooling around his boots. He assumed it was condensation or spillage from a cooling system test. Submarines under construction always had water in odd places, leaking hoses, drainage from pressure tests, rainwater that infiltrated through open hatches. He ignored it and continued welding. The pool deepened. It spread aft, flowing along the slight downward slope of the deck. The welder's boots were submerged to the ankles when he finally looked down and realized the water was rising faster than any spill could account for. He dropped his torch, grabbed the sound-powered phone handset mounted on the bulkhead, and cranked the generator. No answer. The line was dead. He ran aft toward the nearest ladder. Water was entering the submarine through the sonar dome access hatch, a 30-inch circular opening in the bow that allowed technicians to enter the sonar sphere for equipment installation and maintenance. The hatch cover, a heavy steel disc with a rubber gasket and 8 manual dogs, had been removed earlier in the day by a civilian crew installing sonar components. The crew had left for dinner at 5 p.m., intending to return and close the hatch after their break. They had not returned. The hatch remained open, a round portal connecting the interior of the submarine to the waters of San Francisco Bay. At high tide, the waterline sat just below the lip of the opening. As the tide rose, water began to spill over the edge. A trickle at first, then a steady flow, then a cascade as the bow sank lower and the water pressure increased. Simultaneously, at the stern of the submarine, another civilian crew was conducting a ballast tank test. The test required flooding the aft ballast tanks with water to verify that the tanks held pressure and that the vents and blows functioned correctly. The crew opened the flood valves. Water from the bay poured into the aft tanks through open sea chests, exactly as designed. The tanks filled. The stern settled lower into the water. The crew, working in the engine room and focused on monitoring pressure gauges, did not notice that the bow was also sinking. They assumed the settling was normal for a ballast test. No one had informed them that the sonar dome hatch was open forward. No one had informed the sonar installation crew that a ballast test was underway aft. The two crews worked in isolation, each executing their assigned tasks, neither aware that they were flooding opposite ends of the submarine simultaneously. The physics of the situation became irreversible at 6:04 p.m. The bow, now taking on water through the open sonar hatch, sank low enough that water began entering through a second open access point, a cable penetration in the forward ballast tank that had not yet been sealed. The flow rate doubled. The submarine's trim shifted past the point where pumps could compensate. The bow sank faster. More water poured through the sonar hatch. The stern, heavy with ballast water, provided no counterbalance. The submarine began what submariners call a down angle, a slow-motion dive that, in open water, would be corrected by blowing ballast tanks and reversing the dive planes. Gitaro had no compressed air connected to her ballast system. Her dive planes were locked in the neutral position. She had no way to arrest her descent. Workers inside the submarine felt the deck tilt beneath them. Those in the forward compartments heard the sound of rushing water, a low roar echoing through the empty spaces. Panic spread in the darkness. Men scrambled toward ladders leading to escape trunks. Some made it to the upper deck. Others, deeper in the hull, found their routes blocked by rising water. The emergency lighting, not yet connected to the backup batteries, failed to activate. Men climbed through blackness, hands groping for ladder rungs, voices shouting warnings and directions that no one could hear over the noise of water and the metallic banging of loose equipment shifting as the submarine rolled. On the pier, the night shift supervisor reached a pier-mounted telephone and called the shipyard emergency center. He reported a submarine sinking at Building Ways 3. The dispatcher, skeptical, asked him to repeat the report. Submarines do not sink at the pier. They sink at sea, in combat, or during deep diving tests. They do not sink while under construction in calm water, under the care of trained shipyard personnel. The supervisor repeated the report, his voice rising. The dispatcher activated the shipyard fire brigade and damage control teams. Sirens began to wail across the yard. Gitaro settled onto the bottom of the slip at 6:22 p.m., 35 minutes after the first signs of trouble. The water depth at the pier was 37 feet. The submarine's sail, the vertical structure housing the periscopes and masts, remained above water, along with a section of the aft deck. The forward section, including the bow planes and the sonar dome, rested on mud. The hull, designed to withstand the crushing pressure of deep ocean dives, suffered no structural damage from the impact. The damage was to systems, equipment, and Navy pride. Divers entered the water within an hour, carrying underwater lights and cutting torches. Their mission was to assess damage and determine whether any personnel remained trapped inside. They found the interior flooded to a depth of 15 feet forward and 8 feet aft, with equipment floating in the murky water. Electrical panels, not yet waterproofed, had shorted out, sending sparks arcing through the flooded compartments until someone on the pier threw the main breaker. No one was trapped inside. All workers had evacuated. The only casualties were time, money, and reputation. If you are enjoying this investigation into history's hidden conflicts, please verify your subscription to the channel Cold War Chronicles. We declassify the past to understand the present. The immediate aftermath was not heroic salvage, but bureaucratic paralysis. No one wanted to take responsibility. The sonar installation crew, when located at a nearby diner, insisted they had intended to return and close the hatch. The ballast test crew insisted they had followed their written procedures exactly. The shift supervisor insisted he had not been informed of either operation. The project office insisted that coordination was the responsibility of the contractor. The contractor insisted that coordination was the responsibility of the Navy. While the arguments unfolded in conference rooms, Gitaro sat on the bottom, her interior systems soaking in salt water, her construction schedule destroyed. The salvage operation began on May 17th, after 48 hours of planning. Compressed air was pumped into the sealed compartments to displace water and provide buoyancy. Pumps were lowered through hatches to remove water from flooded spaces. Divers sealed the sonar hatch and the cable penetrations that had allowed water to enter. Slowly, as water was removed and air was added, the submarine rose. She broke the surface on May 19th, 4 days after sinking, her hull streaked with mud and rust, her interior a wreck of waterlogged equipment and corroded wiring. The Navy convened a formal investigation. The investigation board interviewed more than 100 witnesses, reviewed work schedules, inspected quality control procedures, and analyzed the command structure at Mare Island. Their findings, released in classified and unclassified versions, were devastating. Item 1. No single individual had responsibility for coordinating work activities on Gitaro. Item 2. The project office relied on contractors to self-coordinate, a system that worked only when contractors chose to communicate, which they rarely did. Item 3. Watertight integrity during construction was treated as a low priority because submarines under construction were assumed to be safe at the pier. Item 4. The sonar installation crew and the ballast test crew were employed by different contractors, reported to different supervisors, and had no procedure for checking with each other before beginning work that affected the submarine's stability. The investigation identified the immediate cause as human error, specifically the failure of the sonar crew to close the hatch before leaving for dinner. But the deeper cause was systemic. Mare Island Naval Shipyard, overburdened with construction projects and understaffed due to budget cuts, had lost control of the work environment. Contractors operated independently. Schedules slipped. Quality assurance inspections were skipped to save time. The shipyard, once a model of precision engineering, had become a chaotic assembly line where submarines were built by committee, no one in charge, everyone responsible, which meant no one responsible. The cost of the sinking was calculated in multiple ledgers. Direct salvage costs, $2 million. Repair and replacement of damaged equipment, $25 million. Schedule delay, 8 months. But the psychological cost was incalculable. Mare Island had been building submarines since 1917. The yard had produced diesel boats for World War II, nuclear boats for the Cold War, and had never lost a submarine in construction. The sinking of Guittaro broke a half-century record of competence. Morale among shipyard workers collapsed. Contractors began to leave for private sector jobs. Engineers requested transfers. The yard's reputation, built over decades, was destroyed in 35 minutes. In Washington, the Chief of Naval Operations received a summary of the investigation and ordered a fleet-wide review of construction practices at all naval shipyards. The review revealed that Mare Island was not an isolated case. Item 1. At Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, a submarine under construction had nearly flooded due to an improperly secured sea valve. Item 2. At Electric Boat in Groton, quality control inspectors reported intimidation by contractors who resented oversight. Item 3. At Newport News, schedule pressure had led to the installation of equipment that had not been tested, resulting in multiple failures during sea trials. The pattern was clear. The submarine construction program, pushed to accelerate production to counter Soviet naval expansion, had sacrificed procedural discipline for speed. Admiral Hyman Rickover, the irascible and legendary head of the Naval Reactors Program, read the reports and issued a scathing memo. He noted that the sinking of Guittaro was not a failure of technology, but a failure of management. Submarines were complex machines, requiring obsessive attention to detail, strict adherence to procedure, and accountability at every level. Mare Island had abandoned those principles. The contractors had been allowed to operate without supervision. The project office had become a paper-shuffling bureaucracy that tracked schedules but did not enforce standards. Rickover demanded immediate reforms. He demanded that every contractor working on nuclear submarines be subject to direct Navy oversight. He demanded that shipyard commanders be held personally accountable for construction failures. And he demanded that any shipyard that could not meet his standards be shut down. The reforms were implemented slowly, resisted by contractors who saw them as intrusive, by shipyard commanders who saw them as insulting, and by budget officers who saw them as expensive. But the sinking of Guittaro had created a political environment where resistance was impossible. Congress, already skeptical of cost overruns in defense programs, demanded accountability. The press, delighted by a story combining incompetence and expensive hardware, published detailed accounts of the sinking, complete with diagrams showing the open hatch and the flooded compartments. The Navy, embarrassed, could not refuse reform. Guittaro herself was eventually repaired, commissioned in September 1972, and served for 20 years without major incident. She conducted Cold War deterrent patrols, tracked Soviet submarines, and participated in intelligence-gathering operations that remain classified. her crew never fully escaped the stigma of serving on the boat that sank at the pier. Other submariners called her the Guitarro Hilton, implying that her crew had it easy because they had already survived the worst thing that could happen to a submarine. The jokes were bitter. The crew understood that the sinking was not their fault, but the stain remained. The broader question haunted the Navy for years. If a submarine could sink at the pier due to lack of coordination, what other failures were lurking in the construction pipeline? How many submarines were being delivered with hidden defects because inspectors were overworked or intimidated? How many safety procedures were being ignored because schedules demanded speed? The investigation into Guitarro opened a door the Navy had preferred to keep closed, revealing a construction system that was fragile, disorganized, and vulnerable to cascading failures. The answer was not comforting. Mare Island was not an outlier. The entire submarine construction enterprise, stretched thin by Cold War demands, was operating on the edge of chaos. And chaos, as Guitarro proved, was only 35 minutes away. The chaos revealed by Guitarro's sinking was not confined to Mare Island. The Navy's fleet-wide review, conducted between June and December 1969, documented a pattern of failures that suggested the submarine construction program had outgrown the institutional capacity to manage it. The review teams visited every active submarine construction facility in the United States, Mare Island in California, Portsmouth, Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, and Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. At each location, investigators found variations of the same dysfunction that had sunk Guitarro. Contractors worked without coordination. Project offices tracked paperwork but not actual work. Quality control inspectors were overwhelmed by the volume of systems requiring certification. And underlying all of it was schedule pressure, the relentless demand to deliver submarines faster to counter a Soviet naval buildup that intelligence assessments described as existential. The Soviet threat was real, but the American response had created its own crisis. Between 1965 and 1970, the United States Navy commissioned 37 nuclear submarines, an average of more than 7 per year. Each submarine required approximately 4 years to build, from keel laying to commissioning, which meant that at any given moment, more than 24 submarines were under construction simultaneously across 4 shipyards. The workforce required to sustain that pace exceeded 50,000 people. Welders, electricians, pipe fitters, reactor technicians, quality inspectors, engineers, and administrators. Many were civilians employed by contractors. Many were young, hired rapidly to meet production quotas, and trained on the job rather than in formal apprenticeships. The older generation of shipyard workers, men who had built World War II submarines and learned their trade through years of experience, were retiring or dying, taking with them institutional knowledge that could not be replaced by training manuals. Mare Island exemplified the demographic problem. In 1945, the yard employed 12,000 workers, most of them veterans of pre-war apprenticeship programs. By 1969, the workforce had grown to 18,000, but fewer than 3,000 had more than 10 years of experience. The rest were recent hires, many of them drawn from the agricultural Central Valley or from communities with no shipbuilding tradition. They learned to weld by welding. They learned to read blueprints by making mistakes. The quality of their work varied wildly. Some took pride in precision. Others simply wanted a paycheck and performed the minimum required to pass inspection, assuming inspections actually occurred. The inspection process itself had been corrupted by schedule pressure. Quality assurance inspectors at Mare Island were responsible for certifying that work met Navy specifications before contractors moved to the next phase of construction. In theory, no work proceeded until the previous work had been inspected and approved. In practice, contractors routinely began new work before inspections were complete because waiting for inspectors caused delays, and delays triggered financial penalties written into contracts. The inspectors, understaffed and overworked, often signed off on work they had not personally examined. relying on contractor self-reports. The system assumed honesty. Guittaro proved that assumption was fatal. The specific failures documented during the fleet-wide review read like a catalogue of near misses. At Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, a submarine under construction had suffered a minor flooding incident when a sea valve, supposed to be closed and locked during pierside work, was found open during a routine inspection. Water had entered the valve and flooded a pump room before being discovered. The investigation revealed that the valve had been opened by a contractor performing a pressure test and had not been closed because the contractor assumed someone else would close it. No one did. The flooding was contained, but only because a watchstander happened to notice water in a bilge that should have been dry. At Electric Boat, quality control inspectors reported that contractors had installed reactor components without the required radiation shielding because the shielding materials had not arrived on schedule. The contractors, unwilling to halt work and trigger schedule delays, installed the components anyway, intending to add shielding later. The inspectors discovered the omission during a random walkthrough. The reactor had to be partially disassembled, the shielding installed, and the components reinstalled. The rework cost 6 weeks and $1.2 million. The contractor faced no penalty because the contract allowed for schedule adjustments due to material shortages. At Newport News, investigators found that electrical panels on a newly commissioned submarine had failed during sea trials because the panels had been installed without proper waterproofing. The contractor had used commercial-grade sealant instead of military-grade sealant specified in the blueprints. The commercial sealant degraded in salt water. The panels shorted out. The submarine lost power to critical systems and had to return to port under emergency diesel propulsion. The contractor claimed the substitution was standard practice and that military-grade sealant was unnecessarily expensive. The Navy disagreed. The contractor was fined, but the submarine still required months of rework. The pattern was systemic. Contractors cut corners to save time and money. Inspectors, overwhelmed, missed the shortcuts. Problems were discovered late, often during sea trials, or, worse, during operational deployments. And the cost of fixing problems after the fact vastly exceeded the cost of doing the work correctly in the first place. The Navy was paying twice, once for defective work and again for rework, while also suffering schedule delays that undermined the strategic goal of matching Soviet submarine production. Admiral Rickover's response was characteristically blunt. In a meeting with the Chief of Naval Operations and the Secretary of the Navy, he stated that the submarine construction program was on the verge of collapse. He argued that the Navy had prioritized quantity over quality and that the result was a fleet of submarines with hidden defects that would reveal themselves at the worst possible moments. He cited Guittaro as proof that the system could not be trusted. He demanded that every submarine under construction be subjected to a full inspection, that any submarine found to have defects be taken out of service until repaired, and that contractors failing to meet standards be barred from future Navy work. The proposal was politically and financially impossible. A full inspection of every submarine under construction would halt production for months. Taking defective submarines out of service would reduce the operational fleet at a time when Soviet submarine activity was increasing. Barring contractors from future work would leave the Navy with insufficient shipyard capacity to meet construction goals. The proposal was rejected. Instead, the Navy implemented a compromise: enhanced oversight, mandatory quality checks at key milestones, and financial penalties for contractors who failed inspections. The reforms were real, but incremental. They addressed symptoms, not causes. The deeper cause was economic. The United States was fighting a war in Vietnam, funding a strategic bomber program, building a ballistic missile defense system, and maintaining a global network of military bases. The defense budget, though massive, was stretched thin. Submarine construction competed with aircraft carriers, destroyers, and fighter jets for funding. Every dollar spent on inspections and rework was a dollar not spent on building new submarines. The pressure to deliver submarines on schedule and under budget was relentless, and that pressure flowed downward through the Navy bureaucracy to the shipyards and contractors, where it manifested as shortcuts, omissions, and the kind of catastrophic negligence that sank Gitaro. Gitaro herself, meanwhile, sat in a repair dock at Mare Island, surrounded by scaffolding and flooded with harsh light from arc welders working around the clock to replace corroded systems. The sonar array, the most expensive component of the submarine, had been destroyed by saltwater immersion. The BQQ-2 sonar system cost $14 million and required 18 months to manufacture. Replacement units were not sitting in warehouses. They were custom-built to order. Mare Island had to wait. While waiting, workers replaced electrical panels, stripped and repainted corroded surfaces, tested and retested every valve and pump, and essentially rebuilt the forward third of the submarine. The crew assigned to Gitaro, officers and enlisted men who had trained for months to operate her, waited as well. They had been told the submarine would commission in January 1970, then March, then June. The delays stretched. Morale suffered. Some crew members requested transfers. Others simply accepted that they were part of the Navy's most famous embarrassment and tried to make peace with it. The commanding officer, a career submarine officer who had not been aboard during the sinking but inherited the aftermath, held weekly meetings to reassure the crew that Gitaro would be an excellent boat once repairs were complete. The reassurance rang hollow. Everyone knew that the boat's reputation was ruined before she ever went to sea. The broader institutional response to the Gitaro incident revealed fractures within the Navy's leadership. Some admirals argued that the sinking was an isolated incident caused by specific failures at Mare Island, and that systemic reforms were unnecessary. Others argued that Mare Island was a symptom of deeper problems, and that without fundamental changes, more submarines would fail in more spectacular ways. The debate played out in classified memos and tense meetings, and the resolution was predictably bureaucratic. Create new oversight committees, write new procedures, and hope that the appearance of reform would prevent future disasters. But hope is not a strategy, and new procedures are meaningless if no one enforces them. The contractors who had flooded Gitaro were not fired. The project office personnel who had failed to coordinate the work were not disciplined. The shipyard commander retired on schedule with full honors. The system absorbed the failure, filed the reports, and moved on. Gitaro became a case study in training courses, a cautionary tale told to new inspectors and project managers, but the conditions that caused the sinking remained largely intact. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union watched and learned. Soviet naval intelligence had tracked the Gitaro incident through open-source reporting in American newspapers, which had gleefully published details of the sinking. The reports were translated, analyzed, and circulated among Soviet submarine designers and naval strategists. The analysis was straightforward. American submarine construction, despite its technological superiority, was vulnerable to organizational dysfunction. The Soviets, whose own submarine program suffered from chronic quality problems, took some comfort in the knowledge that even the Americans made catastrophic mistakes. But the Soviet analysis missed the crucial difference. When American submarines failed, the failures were investigated, documented, and corrected. When Soviet submarines failed, the failures were often covered up, blamed on individual scapegoats, and repeated. The Soviet system prioritized secrecy over learning. The American system, for all its flaws, prioritized transparency, at least internally. That difference, over time, compounded into a strategic advantage. American submarines improved. Soviet submarines stagnated. Gitaro eventually returned to service in September 1972, more than 3 years after her scheduled commissioning date. Her first patrol was uneventful, as were her subsequent patrols over the next 2 decades. She performed as designed. Her systems functioned reliably. Her crew, despite the stigma, operated her with professionalism. And yet the question lingered. How many other submarines carried hidden defects? installed during the same chaotic construction period, that had not yet revealed themselves? How many valves had been improperly sealed? How many welds had been inadequately inspected? How many electrical panels used substandard components? The Navy could not answer those questions without inspecting every submarine in the fleet, a task that would require years and cost billions. So the Navy did what institutions do when facing uncomfortable truths. It accepted the risk, monitored for failures, and hoped that the law of averages would favor them. The hope was not entirely unfounded. Most submarines functioned correctly most of the time. But most is not all, and most of the time is not always. And in the underwater environment where a single failure can kill everyone aboard, most is not good enough. The risk materialized in ways large and small over the following decades, validating both the fears of those who demanded reform and the complacency of those who believed the Guittaro incident was an anomaly. In 1973, USS Woodrow Wilson, a ballistic missile submarine commissioned in 1963, suffered a reactor coolant leak during a routine patrol in the Atlantic. The leak was caused by a corroded valve that had been improperly installed during construction 10 years earlier. The valve had passed initial inspections because the inspector had checked paperwork rather than physically examining the installation. The corrosion progressed slowly, invisible behind layers of insulation and shielding, until the valve failed under pressure. The crew contained the leak using emergency procedures, and the submarine returned to port without casualties. But the incident forced the Navy to inspect similar valves on every submarine in the fleet, a process that took 8 months and revealed 12 additional valves with improper installations. In 1978, USS Guittaro herself experienced a near-catastrophic failure during a training exercise off the coast of California. A seawater cooling pump, part of the reactor's secondary cooling system, seized due to a manufacturing defect in the pump bearings. The bearings had been supplied by a subcontractor who had falsified quality control certificates to avoid the expense of proper testing. The pump failure caused the reactor to overheat. The crew initiated an emergency shutdown and switched to backup cooling. The reactor was saved, but the submarine was forced to operate on limited power for 3 days while backup systems maintained safe temperatures. The investigation traced the defective bearings to a batch of components manufactured in 1969 during the height of the construction surge and installed in multiple submarines. The Navy recalled and replaced the bearings across the fleet. In 1982, USS La Jolla, a Los Angeles-class fast-attack submarine, experienced flooding in the forward torpedo room when a torpedo tube muzzle door failed to seal properly. The door had been installed with a gasket that did not meet Navy specifications. The gasket material, supposed to withstand seawater at depth, degraded after repeated pressure cycles. The flooding was controlled before it became critical, but the submarine surfaced and returned to port. The gasket supplier, when confronted, claimed that the gaskets had met the specifications in effect at the time of manufacture, and that the Navy had changed specifications without notifying suppliers. The dispute became a legal battle that dragged on for years, during which the Navy replaced gaskets on every torpedo tube in the fleet at a cost exceeding $30 million. Each incident, taken individually, was survivable. The crews were trained, the backup systems functioned, the submarines returned safely. But each incident also represented a failure that could have been prevented if the work had been done correctly in the first place. And each incident reinforced the lesson that Guittaro had taught. The submarine construction system, stressed beyond its capacity during the Cold War buildup, had produced a fleet with latent defects that revealed themselves unpredictably, sometimes years or decades after construction. The human cost of these failures was not measured in deaths, because no American submarine was lost due to construction defects during this period. But the cost was measured in fear. Submarine crews operated with the knowledge that their boats might contain hidden flaws, that a valve might fail, a weld might crack, a component might be substandard. The fear was not paralyzing, but it was persistent, a background anxiety that every submariner learned to manage. They trusted their training, their equipment, and each other. But trust is not certainty, and the gap between the two was filled with doubt. The institutional response to these failures followed a predictable pattern. After each incident, the Navy convened an investigation, identified the root cause, implemented corrective measures, and declared the problem solved. New inspection protocols were written. New quality standards were mandated. Contractors were warned. And then the cycle repeated. The problem was not that the Navy failed to respond. The problem was that the responses addressed individual failures without fixing the underlying system that generated the failures. The underlying system was economic and cultural. Economically, the submarine construction program operated under constant budget pressure. Congress appropriated funds for a specific number of submarines per year, and the Navy was expected to deliver those submarines on schedule and within budget. Overruns were scrutinized, delays were criticized. The pressure to perform created incentives to cut corners, to accept marginal work, to defer maintenance, and to prioritize schedule over quality. Culturally, the shipyards operated under a hierarchical structure where authority was concentrated at the top and accountability was diffused throughout the organization. When something went wrong, blame flowed downward to the lowest level possible. Contractors blamed workers. Workers blamed supervisors. Supervisors blamed project officers. Project officers blamed the Navy. The Navy blamed contractors. No one accepted systemic responsibility. Admiral Rickover understood this, and his response was to centralize authority in the Naval Reactors Program, the office responsible for all nuclear propulsion systems. Rickover's office controlled the design, manufacture, installation, and operation of every reactor in the fleet. Contractors who worked on reactors answered directly to Rickover's inspectors. Quality standards were absolute. Failures were not tolerated, and the result was that reactor-related failures were extraordinarily rare. The reactor that powered Gitaro, despite the submarine's disastrous construction history, operated flawlessly for 20 years. The reactor on USS Woodrow Wilson, despite the coolant leak, never failed. Rickover's system worked because it was rigid, uncompromising, and enforced by a man who had the political power to fire contractors, overrule admirals, and demand compliance. But Rickover's authority extended only to reactors. The rest of the submarine, the hull, the sonar, the torpedoes, the electrical systems, the plumbing, was outside his jurisdiction. Those systems were managed by the traditional Navy bureaucracy, which lacked Rickover's focus and lacked his willingness to punish failure. The result was a split personality fleet, reactors that were nearly perfect, and everything else that was merely adequate. The adequacy was sufficient for peacetime operations, where submarines patrolled predictable routes, operated under controlled conditions, and had time to address problems before they became critical. But adequacy is not sufficient for wartime, where submarines operate at the limits of their capabilities, where damage control is conducted under fire, and where a single failure can mean the difference between survival and death. The Cold War never turned hot, and so the adequacy of American submarine construction was never tested under the conditions for which the submarines were designed. The Soviets, meanwhile, faced their own construction crises, but with less transparency and harsher consequences. Soviet submarines suffered catastrophic failures at a rate far exceeding American submarines. Between 1960 and 1990, the Soviet Navy lost 9 submarines to accidents, compared to 2 American submarines lost during the same period. The Soviet losses included reactor meltdowns, fires, collisions, and floodings caused by defects that would have been caught by American inspection standards. But Soviet inspection standards were lower, and Soviet accountability was punitive rather than corrective. When a Soviet submarine failed, the officers were court-martialed, The crew was reassigned, and the incident was classified. No public investigation, no systemic reform. The same mistakes repeated. The comparison between American and Soviet submarine construction reveals a fundamental difference in institutional culture. American failures were investigated openly, documented extensively, and used as lessons to improve future performance. Soviet failures were hidden, denied, and blamed on individuals rather than systems. The American approach, for all its flaws, allowed for learning and improvement. The Soviet approach ensured stagnation. Gitaro, in this context, was both a failure and a success. A failure because she sank at the pier due to inexcusable negligence. A success because the Navy investigated the sinking, published the findings, implemented reforms, and used the incident to improve shipyard practices across the fleet. The reforms were incomplete and imperfect, but they were real, and over time, they made a difference. By the 1980s, American submarine construction had stabilized, quality improved, failures decreased. The lessons of Gitaro, painful and expensive, had been absorbed, but the question remains, could the sinking have been prevented? The answer is unambiguously yes. If the sonar installation crew had closed the hatch, if the ballast test crew had coordinated with other workers, if the project office had enforced watertight integrity protocols, if the shipyard commander had insisted on centralized control, if any one of a dozen individuals had made a different decision, Gitaro would not have sunk. The failure was not inevitable. It was the result of choices, or more precisely, the result of failing to choose accountability over convenience. The legacy of USS Gitaro is not the submarine itself, which served competently for 2 decades and was decommissioned without distinction in 1992. The legacy is the revelation that even the most technologically advanced military in the world is vulnerable to organizational dysfunction. That complexity requires coordination, and that coordination requires authority, and authority requires individuals willing to accept responsibility. Gitaro sank because no one was in charge. The lesson, simple and brutal, applies beyond submarines and shipyards. It applies to any organization that prioritizes speed over process, output over quality, and appearances over reality. The submarine, raised from the mud and repaired at great expense, went to sea and did her job. The system that built her, exposed and criticized, adjusted and continued. The men who worked on her, blamed and defensive, learned or did not learn, and moved on to other projects. And the Navy, embarrassed but resilient, filed the reports, updated the manuals, and prepared for the next crisis. Because there would be a next crisis. There always is.